in American history. This is the second civil rights movement in American history. The first one was in the 1860s. We will be looking at the civil rights movement as it emerged out of World War II and continued throughout the 1940s, 50s, 60s, into the 1970s. Some of the early civil rights struggles in the United States began as early as slavery. From 1619 to 1865, slavery existed in the United States. The majority of African Americans were considered property, not legally considered people. Debate raged over the issue of slavery throughout American history. In 1857, Dred Scott v. Sanford was decided by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that African Americans were not citizens of the United States and that slavery was a Fifth Amendment property right. In 1863, during the Civil War, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This executive order freed the slaves in the Confederate States only. Southerners did not recognize its authority. However, many African Americans used this as a chance to join the Union Army and fight against the Confederate States. After the Civil War, the issue of slavery needed to be permanently decided. And in 1865, the Radical Republicans passed the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States. In 1865, almost immediately after slavery was abolished, Southern state legislatures began passing black codes. These black codes became the foundation for Jim Crow laws in America, and these black codes basically attempted to keep African Americans in a state of second-class citizenship. In 1865, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. This declared that all persons born in the United States were now citizens of the United States without regard to race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Black codes made this law almost impossible to enforce. In fact, this law was vetoed by President Andrew Johnson. The veto was overturned with a 2/3 majority in Congress. But since it was really hard to enforce in the states, Congress then came back and passed the 14th Amendment, amending the Constitution, which basically says the same thing, that all persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States. And it also goes one step further and guarantees that all citizens of the United States are entitled to equal protection of the law. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed. This guaranteed the right of citizens of the United States to vote, regardless of their race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Effectively, this grants African American men the legal right to vote. However, with poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, this too is very hard to enforce in many regions of the United States. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled on the Plessy v. Ferguson case. This was a challenge directly to the segregation laws and the Jim Crow laws in the South. The Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal public facilities were constitutional. And so from 1896 to 1955, segregation was legally, constitutionally sanctioned, and Jim Crow reigned supreme in many places in the South. In the early part of the 20th century, one of the single largest demographic shifts in the history of the nation took place in the Great Migration. Many African Americans moved north for economic opportunities that were afforded to them by World War I and the opening up of the industrial markets in the north. Many of those African Americans thought that they would go north and that they would escape racism, but unfortunately we see that as this demographic shift takes place, racism follows. In the 1920s, there is a flourishing of art, music, culture, painting, plays, movies coming out of Black communities. This becomes known as the Harlem Renaissance because that was really the heart of the movement itself. The new idea of the new Negro and the Black is Beautiful movement were born during this time period. The NAACP grows significantly. And there is another group called the UNIA under the guidance of Marcus Garvey, who actually advocates for a Back to Africa movement. So Harlem Renaissance is this wonderful time period of expansion of art and culture and music. We know that a lot of people took advantage of the 1920s to kind of throw off the yoke of traditional society and flaunt those socially accepted norms, and this was all the rage in Harlem itself. During the Great Depression, the country faces very, very tough times, and there is an incident which takes place in Scottsboro as these 9 African American young men are arrested and tried for the alleged rape of 2 white teenagers on this train. A lot of these people were riding the train for traveling around the country as hobos. These 2 young ladies had been arrested for vagrancy in the past. One of them did not want to go back to prison, and so she concocted this story that they had been raped by these men on the train. Only 2 of these young men knew each other, and that was because one of them was escorting another one who was blind. This had major international attention focus on this case. There was no physical evidence that a rape had taken place. However, all 9 of these men were convicted and sentenced to death. They kept appealing it. This case went back to court 3 different times, and they kept getting found guilty even though there was no physical evidence. This calls attention from the Justice Department to what was taking place, and the Justice Department began an investigation and found that there were no African Americans serving on juries in the South. And so this then led to interracial juries being required in cases with Black defendants. But the major catalyst for change was World War II. In 1941, Philip Randolph organized a march. This was going to be the first march on Washington to protest the limited use of African American labor by companies with contracts from the War Industries Board. President Roosevelt did not want a large number of people rushing in and marching on Washington, and so he and Randolph work out a deal. Roosevelt issues the Executive Order 8802, which prohibited companies with government contracts from discrimination in hiring. So effectively, it forced companies, if they wanted to have government contracts, to integrate their workforces or to not discriminate against Black workers or Jewish workers or women for that matter. And the Fair Employment Practices Committee was founded. Jim Crow laws in the United States were a major contradiction for the fight for freedom abroad. So Philip Randolph and CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, begin what's known as the Double V campaign for victory abroad and victory at home. On the home front, after the war, we begin to see some changes taking place in social aspects as well. In 1947, Major League Baseball leads the way for integration. Jackie Robinson was signed by the Brooklyn Dodgers, officially integrating Major League Baseball. Plenty of times I wanted to haul off when somebody insulted me for the color of my skin, but I had to hold myself. I knew I was kind of an experiment. Jackie Robinson was chosen because of a formal civil rights legacy. He also was college educated. He was from Los Angeles, so he had not grown up in the Jim Crow South, and in fact was kind of shocked when he went to basic training in the South and was treated very, very poorly by a bus driver, although he was an officer. Both players and fans alike were very resistant to the integration of Major League Baseball. Jackie Robinson received death threats, players were very angry that he was on the playing field. People threw things at him from the stands. But Jackie Robinson knew he had to hold his cool. And so he then was able to maintain his composure in the face of all this adversity. And his natural talent, his skills, and his ability eventually won his adversaries over. And he becomes one of the most celebrated baseball players in all time. And in fact, on April 15th, every year, all players in Major League Baseball wear number 42 to celebrate Jackie Robinson Day. President Harry Truman becomes a very unlikely champion for civil rights. President Harry Truman was kind of appalled at the way that the veterans were being treated when they had returned home from fighting in World War II. Many African American men, when they were hauled off of buses when they returned home in their uniforms and beaten, they still had to go to segregated lunch counters. They still had to ride on the back of the bus. And President Truman was very disappointed that our country hadn't moved further than this based on the experiences that we had in World War II. Many of these African American soldiers said that they were treated better in Europe, and in particular, even in Nazi Europe, than they were here at home. So President Truman takes a step. He gives a civil rights address to the United States Congress. I am asking for equality of treatment for all human beings without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. And he issues Executive Order 9981, which integrated the U.S. Armed Forces. In addition, President Truman sends out the Freedom Train, which toured the nation. The Freedom Train had on it several of our founding documents, a copy of the 13th Amendment, a copy of the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence. And one of the things that President Truman insisted on was that there would not be a segregated viewing of any of these documents that expanded freedom. If you wanted the train to stop in your town, you had to allow integrated viewings. This went off in major southern cities without a hitch. You're going to pause now from listening to me, and I'm going to show you a few film clips which highlight the things that we just talked about. After the integration of the armed forces and the integration of baseball, the NAACP, CORE, and other civil rights organizations pushed really hard to get integration, the overturning of segregation laws in America. Probably one of the most famous cases is the Brown v. Board of Education case, which takes place in 1954, which ends the segregation of public schools in America. The case of Linda Brown and her parents challenging the Topeka Board of Education's policy of segregated schools is in fact only one of 5 cases. There was a case from Delaware, the District of Columbia, South Carolina, and Virginia as well. The NAACP merged these cases, but the Brown case was the first plaintiff, so it gets the title. Thurgood Marshall, the chief counsel of the NAACP, argued the case before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Brown. This was a precedent-setting case. It overturned the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision, which had established the separate but equal doctrine. Does segregation of children in public schools deprive children of equal opportunities? We believe it does. The Brown case dramatically changed the United States. Segregation was no longer allowed in public schools. This is then going to set off a slew of push for the integration of public schools and the integration of United States society as a whole. In December of 1955, the next major event of the civil rights movement takes place, and this is known as the Montgomery bus boycott. This is the famous incident in which Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat, challenging the accepted practice of blacks being regulated to the back of the bus. It was time for someone to stand up, or in my case, to sit down. I refused to move, Ms. Park said. This was part of a larger movement with the NAACP. This had taken place earlier in other cities. People had refused to move off the buses. But nothing as large as what happens in Montgomery had ever happened. This sparked a boycott, a refusal to use the buses for 381 days in Montgomery. 2/3 of the ridership were African American. This almost bankrupted the Montgomery bus system. Boycotters walked to work. They organized carpools. The Montgomery Improvement Association was created to help organize this boycott, these carpools. People from all over the country donated money to buy station wagons, to organize carpools. This went on for over a year. And in November of 1956, the Supreme Court outlawed bus segregation. The Montgomery bus boycott is where a young man by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. first becomes heavily involved in the movement. Martin Luther King Jr. had just moved to Montgomery from Atlanta, Georgia. He kind of was reluctant to take the leadership in this. In fact, he says that had he known what it meant, he may have said no. But he had been a student of Gandhi. He had advocated for the use of nonviolent tactics in the struggle for civil rights. He practices what's called civil disobedience, which is the idea that you need to follow or refuse to follow laws that are deemed unjust so that they can get into the case and controversy system and be challenged in court. Dr. King led the Montgomery bus boycott. He becomes the face for it on the Montgomery Improvement Association. And in 1957, he is one of the founding leaders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was an organization of young, not just young, but of Black ministers from all across the South who organized together to carry on nonviolent crusades against what they called the evils of second-class citizenship. Black churches were the heart of organizing the movement. The nonviolent tactics that were used by civil rights activists included sit-ins, boycotts, marches. They also participated in demonstrations. They gave speeches. They packed jails to overwhelm both the jails and the court system. They issued petitions. They used the media quite effectively, making sure that the national and local media would be present at their demonstrations. They conducted voter registration drives. They taught classes and educated people about the movement, how to vote, nonviolent tactics. They went into local communities and really attempted to do this from a grassroots method out. What we're going to do now is we are going to go back. Y'all are going to watch a quick video about both the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and then you are also going to watch a brief video about the Montgomery bus boycott, and you are going to read both the Brown case, examining it for the issue before the court, the ruling of the court, the reasoning of the court, and the impact of that court decision. And you're also going to read some opposition to both the Brown decision in the Southern Manifesto, and you're going to hear some white commentary on the Montgomery bus boycott.